Thank you all for coming to the presentation today. I'm really excited to be able to present to you what I've prepared, particularly as you can tell from the heart of this topic is really capacity management. Despite the fancy long title, I mean, 2 words, capacity management is what this is about. And for those of you who are familiar with the company that I come from, vKernel, we're all about building solutions that help people to be able to effectively manage capacity. However, that being said, this presentation is not a pitch by any means. This is about the science and strategy behind capacity management. It's a very practical presentation, things that you can be able to take back to your respective offices and make your lives just that much more better. Now, over the past several years working for vKernel, I've seen all sorts of different environments of shapes and sizes, and I've seen how people manage capacity. And frankly, sometimes it just outright scares me. And yes, some of you in the audience are smiling because you're thinking, hey, that's me. But I'm really hoping that by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to come out of this going, hey, I have a much better grasp of the things I need to be thinking about and considering when I manage capacity. So to get started, the problem. Actually, I stole this screenshot and slide from a friend of mine, Scott Harold. If any of you have seen him speak before, maybe you've seen this before. But kind of in days past, when pretty much everything we had was physical, we had a operating system on a server and an operating system on a server and, well, an operating system on a server. And they were all kind of segmented, and they could do whatever they wanted, and they didn't affect anybody else, and all was fine. One server, as you can see, could be sleeping. Another server could be completely dominating the resources that were on its server, and, well, things were fine. Now in the virtualization world, where we throw all these operating systems on a single server, it quickly evolves into a ride with the kids in the car where, soon enough they start annoying each other, and eventually as a result of that it annoys us. And so you might as well throw in a little quote here that says, oh, he's breathing my air, because that's kind of what's happening now, is where they're sharing resources and they can cause conflicts. So the first part of the problem here really is this topic of SLAs, performance, and making sure that those remain at a high level despite the fact that there's shared resources taking place. The second half of the problem, this graph right here actually comes from a study we've done at vKernel across 500,000 virtual machines, 2,500 virtual environments, and we discovered that as you go from left to right, as environments get larger, the number of hosts increases, the number of VMs per host is decreasing. Your VM density is going down. Now, there's certainly a lot of different various, some small, some great factors that can play into why this is happening. But certainly a huge proponent of that is that as the larger the environment gets, the more hard it gets to manage, the more hard it is to keep track of things. And so certainly the other part of capacity management as a problem here is that cost starts to be affected, that your ROI on the hardware becomes affected. In fact, if you were able to even take a typical environment that has maybe 10 VMs per host, and you were able to get 12 VMs per host, that seems like really kind of a small gain. But if you think about it, if you were able to get from 10 to 12, that's really a 20% gain, which in the grand scheme of things, I mean, is VMware going to give you another 20% discount off the licensing? Are your hardware vendors going to give you another 20% discount off of hardware? Probably not. So this is free money for the taking, and ultimately the solution behind all of this, of course, is capacity management. And that's kind of where all of this is driving towards, is capacity management can help us to solve both these problems simultaneously, to be able to simultaneously help you meet your performance requirements without sacrificing ROI and cost, and vice versa, help you to meet your cost requirements without sacrificing performance. A lot of the common questions I get when I'm talking about capacity with people is, well, what am I doing with my current capacity? How much more can I do with my existing capacity? When will I run out of capacity? How about, can I reclaim capacity? Can I use it more efficiently? And so all of these questions, hopefully over the course of this presentation, will get answered for each of you. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in first of all to Hardware Capacity 101. This is about your hosts, your clusters, and so forth. How much more can you fit on them? And for some of us, it's a little bit of a no-duh. We've been doing it for a while, and this makes sense. And maybe you'll glean a couple of new pieces of information from it. And then for some of you this is kind of new to you, then maybe this entire part right here will certainly be vital to you. So the first part of this, determine total capacity. Now, to understand total capacity, you have to select a scope. What is it you're trying to determine the capacity of? Is it a single host? Is it a cluster? And for the sake of simplicity, as we go through this, my running example is going to be a cluster. And for most of us, we probably want to be looking at the capacity of our environment on a cluster level anyway. Now, once you've selected a scope, the next part is to take the hosts that are within that scope and total up the capacity. So how much memory is available? How much CPU is available? If you want to, you could total up storage that's available. However you want to do that. Then after you've done that, though, all of that capacity is not usable. In fact, if I was to ask you if you would want to fill up your hosts and your clusters to 100%, most of you will probably shake your head and say no. That would be stupid. In fact, I can tell you that even if you were at 95% capacity of memory on your host, already ballooning, swapping, and things like that could be starting to take place, and that's a performance degradation. So we have to make sure that we're not filling up to 100%, but what is it that we should fill up to as a safe threshold? The first important consideration is HA. Do you have HA enabled? And by show of hands, how many of you have HA enabled? So most of you. And from talking to previous people, most of us are using a one-host failover. Now, of course, you could be using a different failover, you could be using a percentage, you could be using a two-host failover, whatever you want. But since you have HA enabled, we have to factor this in. So let's pretend we've got a four-host cluster, and we have got HA enabled, so we're intending for one host to be able to go down and the other three hosts to pick up the workload. For that purpose, we have to pretend that one of the hosts does not exist when we're trying to calculate capacity. So we really, out of that, all of that capacity we really only have 75% of it that's usable. Now, another important consideration is that when you're doing this, if your hosts are not all equal in their sizes, and I know that most of us have equal-sized hosts across the board, but if you have like one or two hosts that are larger than the other in their capacity, then what you want to make sure you do when you calculate capacity is pretend that your largest host went down. And I've seen people who neglected to do this, and unfortunately they were burned as a result of it. So make sure that if for some reason you don't have hosts that are all the same amount of memory, all the same amount of CPU, that you take the biggest ones first and use those for your HA requirements. Now, whether or not you have HA enabled, you need to factor in a buffer. If you don't have HA enabled, you have to determine what is your safe capacity level. Now, for someone who doesn't have HA enabled, you want to get as much value out of your hardware as possible. I'd say that maybe a 20% buffer would be sufficient. So fill up your cluster to 80%, gives you a little bit of extra room, especially for spiking or otherwise. That can work. So 15-20%, you can add or take away from that depending on how liberal or conservative you are with things. At the same time, though, for those of you who are running HA, keep in mind that you do want an additional buffer. In the example I was using earlier, 75% is my usable capacity. However, 75% is now the new 100%, because if I fill up my cluster to 75% capacity and I bring a host down for maintenance mode, guess what? All of my hosts are now at 100%, and my VMs, my application owners, are probably not going to be too happy with me with the performance that they're receiving. So, in the case of you already got HA, you've already got a buffer built in, I'd say anywhere between a 5% and a 15% additional buffer, just so that in the event that you have to use HA, that's there for you. Now the next part of this, find your peak utilization. Now, determine a sufficient window of time to understand peak utilization. If you happen to be seasonal, whether you're in retail or you are a university or whatever, and you have peaks that happen during certain times of the year, you're probably going to want to use a larger window of time. If you're someone who's usually hitting their peaks on a weekly basis, sure, just use you go into vCenter, generate a graph for the past week for memory, CPU, and so forth, and mark down those peak utilizations, and then that will help you to understand what your peak levels are. After that, we're going to use a combination of the usable capacity and the peak utilization to figure out what's our leftover capacity in each of these categories. So say I've got 4 hosts, 100 gigs apiece, and I've got HA enabled, so I've only got 300 gigs that I can use of memory, and I discovered that my peak utilization is 200 gigabytes of memory. So that means I have 100 gigabytes left over of memory. Now, you're going to want to do this for CPU, storage, or any other things that you're trying to measure the capacity of. But also, in particular, most of us probably aren't running out of CPU, to be honest. Now, if you happen to be one of those people that really runs hot on the CPU side, then sure. But for a lot of us, we're going to run out of memory first, and if you're really familiar with your environment, in some cases you may even want to skip doing CPU calculations because you just know that memory is really going to be ultimately your bottleneck. But even then, no matter how you end up doing that, your leftover capacity is really only a means to an end, because it's going to be very subjective on depending on who you are and your environment on what you can actually do with that. If I have 100 gigabytes of memory left over for new virtual machines and I'm throwing out large servers, database servers, and things like that, well, that's not going to take me too far in the grand scheme of things. If I'm someone who's got 100 gigs of memory, though, and I'm deploying virtual desktops that are 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabytes of memory apiece, that could actually take me a long distance. So the next phase of this is determining a VM size so it can lead us towards determining how many actual VMs can we milk out of our existing hardware. To calculate a VM size, really you could use any VM size you want. For myself, I like to use kind of a baseline average VM size. So take those peak utilizations you calculated earlier. Your peak utilization for the cluster was 200 gigabytes, and you've got 50 VMs in that cluster. So if you were to go ahead and just divide the 200 gigabytes peak utilization by 50 VMs, you'll find that your average VM size is about 4 gigabytes. And so that's what I would go off of, just because I have VMs of all different shapes and sizes, and going off of an average size is usually kind of a good guesstimation of being able to calculate and compute your new VM capacity going forward. And so this would be just a matter of, like I said, taking your leftover capacity, dividing it by your average VM size, and then being able to determine your average capacity for new virtual machines. Now, once again, like I said, average VM size, kind of a preference of mine, but certainly you could just go and input any size you want. I want to figure out how many more database servers I can fit. I want to figure out how many virtual desktops I can fit. I've got a template that I use, and I'm going to use that as my size rather than an average. That's fine. But the key here is this is a framework that each of you can use to be able to manage your capacity going forward. In the end, though, update your capacity calculations as needed. Now, this is going to differ for each of you. If you've got a static environment, very low growth, not very dynamic, you might not need to update your capacity very frequently, if at all. Maybe you've got way more hardware than you really need, and you're not growing fast, and you might want to just check back in a year. Sure, that's kind of an extreme. On the other end of things, though, you might have a very dynamic environment. Maybe it's a test lab where you're adding and deleting virtual machines all the time, or maybe it's a production environment where you're constantly doing P2V and new projects. You may want to update your capacity calculations more frequently, just because things change. Things don't go according to plan, and you want to be able to keep a close eye on that because, as we mentioned, you want to make sure that you have enough hardware, that you're meeting your performance requirements, but that you're not sacrificing cost. So some of the difficulties with managing capacity. First of all, admittedly, sadly, there's a lack of sufficient memory metrics available inside vCenter at the moment. And without going into a great amount of detail how these work and so forth, you've got memory active and memory consumed, which are the two metrics that you can look at the VM level, the host level, cluster level, whatever, that will tell you how much memory is being used. Now, how these are measuring what's being used is very different. Memory active is measuring the amount of memory that is being actively used at a point in time. So while if you look at a VM and it's actively using a gigabyte over the course of an hour, it could be a different gigabyte of memory that's being used every moment. And so there's no indication of whether that memory active is the same as the previous memory active. I don't know if that's making sense, but suffice it to say that memory active more often than not will go ahead and understate what a virtual machine host cluster actually uses or needs. And so I'd be very cautious about using memory active as your only metric for understanding what is needed for capacity. The other part of this, memory consumed, is measuring the amount of memory, amount of physical memory that has been mapped to virtual machines, hosts, and so forth. So oftentimes this is a more accurate metric, but it's even then not a perfect metric. And here's why. You have a SQL server that has 8 gigabytes of memory allocated to it. Maybe it only needs 2, maybe it only needs 4, but because you've got caching taking place, that VM's probably going to go ahead and use up and consume all 8 gigabytes of memory. So that can really kind of even skew the memory consumed metric in the opposite direction. So while memory active sometimes can be understated, memory consumed can be overstated. And then you've got large memory pages as well, which is a function of the vSphere 4, vSphere 5 in conjunction with the newer Intel and AMD processors can take advantage of, where basically memory consumed also can become very skewed. Basically it'll show up like the virtual machine's using most or all of the memory that's been allocated, and that can also kind of influence memory consumed as a value. So be kind of cautious, look at both values, use some good judgment when you're looking at those. Another consideration here, before I dive into CPU Ready, let me ask you a question. How many of you are running DRS in your clusters? So most of you. Now, how many, actually out of curiosity, how many of you are also running in fully automated mode? Perfect. So most of us are on the same page. Some of you don't have DRS, some of you aren't running it in fully automated. That's okay. But the thing to take into consideration here is DRS is looking in load balancing on a cluster level across memory and CPU utilization, which when I say CPU utilization, I am meaning megahertz and gigahertz. And because most of us aren't really using up a lot of our CPU, you're not really having to load balance CPU too much. It's really a no-brainer. The one thing that DRS does not look at, the one thing it will not take care of for you when it comes to load balancing, is the ratio of virtual CPUs to physical cores. And that's what CPU Ready is helping you to measure, is when is there performance degradation as a result of having too many virtual CPUs allocated on a host. So you could have 2 different hosts in a cluster. You've got DRS running, balancing things out for you. Both hosts have 30% CPU utilization. They're using 30% of the total gigahertz allotment. However, DRS, like I said, is not looking at ratios. So you could have one host that has 20 virtual CPUs being run on 8 physical cores, and another host that could have 40 virtual CPUs running on 8 physical cores. And so one host could be having really hard time juggling VMs on the CPU scheduler and causing performance issues, like a giant game of musical chairs where not everybody can have a chair at the same time, and it's causing some resource contention. So CPU Ready is definitely a metric that I dive into a lot deeper into my other presentations, like my 20 metrics presentation. But certainly this is something to really kind of take into consideration, because DRS is not going to help you out with this. Lastly, VM sizing is also another difficulty that comes in with managing capacity. In fact, the next part of this presentation is going to be a lot about VM sizing, but suffice it to say that VM sizing impacts your overall capacity. VM sizing also impacts a lot of these bullets that you see above. If you're sizing your VMs correctly, it doesn't matter if they're consuming all of the memory that they've been allocated, because they've been sized correctly. And likewise, if you're sizing your VMs correctly on the CPU side of things, and you're allocating 1 CPU when it doesn't need 4, or 2 CPUs when it doesn't need 8, or whatever the situation may be, then you can oftentimes prevent CPU ready issues from happening in your environment, and you'll probably run out of memory before you run into any sort of CPU contention like that. So another part of our study, where we did it across 500,000 virtual machines, 2,500 virtual environments, as you go from left to right, you see that the green bars get larger and larger. That is how well people are committing CPU on their hardware, and you can see that they usually commit over 200%. then likewise, on RAM commitment, people aren't really committing nearly as much of their RAM as you go towards the left. Kind of the industry average, you can see here that on average people allocate about 2.2 virtual CPUs per physical CPU, and that's okay. In fact, kind of rule of thumb, usually if you stay under a 3-to-1 ratio, things are pretty safe. It's not guaranteed. I've seen people encounter it before then. I've also seen people get up to much higher ratios, but usually a 3-to-1 is a kind of an interesting and good rule of thumb. Now the interesting thing here is that VRAM to physical RAM ratio, they're only allocating 60% of the physical memory that they have. Now you might look at this and say, well, Jonathan, you just told us that we need to have a buffer because I've got HA enabled and I need to have an additional buffer on top of that, and so yeah, sure, I'm only allocating 60% of my memory because I've got these things to take into consideration. However, the reason that this next segment is about sizing is because, yeah, sure, you're only allocating 60% of your memory, but the reality is you're only utilizing 30% of that. And that leaves a lot of money on the table. And so I'm hoping that this next segment right here can really help out with that. Now, before jumping into sizing, how many of you are familiar with this guy right here? Wow. So like nobody has seen this guy. Well, to give you a little bit of a heads up, this is what VMware calls the monster VM. And really VMware made a nice breakthrough where now you can get up to 1 terabyte of memory on a virtual machine and 32 virtual CPUs. And around the release of vSphere 5 and at VMworld 2011, they really kind of drove home this point that they can have these enormous VMs. So quick question for you. How many of you in this room have a virtual machine that is larger than 64 gigabytes of memory? No one? No one at all? So the funny part about this is 64 gigabytes of memory is 5% of the size of a monster VM. And so we're all sitting in this room and none of us are even using 5% of this size that's available to us. Now, of course, maybe we should go tell our DBAs, hey, did you know there's a such thing as a monster VM now? And they're going to be like, oh yeah, give me a couple of those. And you know what we're thinking? This is what I think about monster VMs. This is what you should do if you find one. Now, this doesn't mean you should sit on it, but this means that certainly you should size it. And that a lot of times the struggle here isn't how big can we make virtual machines. A lot of times the struggle is how small can we make them, because we want them to perform well, but a lot of times they're oversized. Now, and above and beyond sizing a virtual machine, just for the sake of reclaiming resources, reducing your vCPU ratios, and so forth, there's an additional cost involved here. And it's important for you to be aware of this. This is actually from VMware's own documentation. Let's use an example. If I have a VM that has 4 virtual CPUs allocated and 8 gigs of RAM, it costs me 413 megabytes of additional memory and overhead, just because of how much I've allocated. And you can see that as you increase in the number of CPUs allocated, your memory overhead goes up, and as you increase in the amount of memory allocated, your memory overhead goes up as well. Now, if we were to half the size of this virtual machine, say give it 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM, above and beyond reclaiming what we've allocated, the overhead cost actually goes down too. Now, I know this seems like a small value, and I know that memory is cheap, but when you've got a host that's maxed out of memory and you can't buy any more, and you want to be able to get one more virtual machine on that host to get you another 10% density or whatever, this right here is just another example of how sizing VMs can be able to do that for you. No matter how small this may seem, this really does add up across an infrastructure when you start sizing things appropriately. So how do we go about sizing virtual machines? So we're going to talk about sizing new virtual machines, and then we're going to talk about sizing existing virtual machines. When it comes to sizing new virtual machines, we recommend allocating the minimum. Now, this is very subjective. And what I mean by subjective is there's a lot of variables here. It's based on the operating system requirements, it's based on the application requirements, and in some cases, It may be even based on politics requirements, where you're told, you know what, give the application owner whatever they ask. We want to make them happy. And you know what, that might have to be your minimum. In other cases where you can, if you could start out at 1 CPU and 2 gigs of RAM, or 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM, and then increase as you go along, it's always easier to give more than to take away, because I can tell you I've never had an application owner complain about giving them more resources. They're like, oh yeah, sure, that's great, give me more. But of course, when you go back to take back later, that can be oftentimes more difficult. So once you've gone ahead and allocated the minimum necessary, monitor resources intensely, and if you can, if it's possible to deploy this virtual machine originally in a test environment of some sort before moving it into full production, this will give you the opportunity to be able to do some testing and experimentation before putting it into production. Now, after you've been monitoring resources intensely, based on the performance of the application, determine if more resources are needed. Look at the peak utilization values on the virtual machine. Make sure it has a nice buffer there that's not getting too close to the 100% or 90% mark. But give it more. If it does need more resources, go ahead and add more in small increments. Now, once again, small is kind of subjective. If you've got a VM where its peak utilizations are getting upwards of 90-95%, and it's got a gig allocated to it, well, maybe a half of a gig would be a sufficient small increment. If you've got a VM that has 8 gigs allocated, it's getting up to 90-95%, maybe 2, 3, or more gigs might be necessary to kind of bump that up, and not only make sure that the peak goes down, but make sure there's a sufficient enough buffer there, so in the event that VM grows, it gets more users in the future, so forth, you're kind of future-proofing that virtual machine. Now, of course, if all is well and you don't need to size it anymore, simply add the VM to a regular monitoring schedule. Now, that regular monitoring schedule is going to differ on who you are. Some of you might say, okay, well, I'm going to check back on this virtual machine in a month just to kind of see how it's doing, make sure it's still living up to expectations. And others of us will just wait until someone screams, and then we'll, of course, jump to our feet and go ahead and put out a fire. So however you want to go about doing that, that is fine. Now, you've got existing virtual machines, and this is kind of the fun part, because we know we've got applications that have been out there for a long time that are oversized. And we know, particularly if you're back in the beginning with sizing new virtual machines, if you're one of those people that, they're like, hey, give the application or whatever he wants, 16 gigs of RAM, 8 CPUs, great. Now what you're going to do is you're going to go back in time and you're going to look at this analysis period, look at some recent data, and understand the peak utilizations of the virtual machine and be able to size it down or maybe even upwards depending on performance. So when I say use recent data, this is really kind of a matter of determining what sort of time window is appropriate. Does this VM hit its peak once every month, once every quarter, and then look at a graph in vCenter across memory, CPU, and so forth to determine what those peaks are. Now, once you find as part of finding the peak utilization, because I mentioned earlier that memory active and consumed, both of those are certainly not the best metrics in the world, I would recommend also looking at OS memory usage. Use all 3 of those different values to kind of triangulate a value that you think would be most appropriate for the peak utilization of that virtual machine. Now, if the virtual machine is significantly below 75% in its peak, you might want to potentially downsize that virtual machine. And I say potentially, and I'll expand upon that more in a moment. And then also, if it's above 75%, you're going to want to evaluate the growth of that virtual machine. Is it just peaking at 75% and it hasn't gone above 75% in the past year? Or is it something where it's continuing to get higher? So this is where we get into forecasting. Look at the trend on the graph of that virtual machine. Is it consistently getting larger? If it is, then you want to kind of project at what rate it's growing and kind of future-proof that. In addition, you want to add another buffer. So yeah, sure, you expect it's going to grow another gig in 3 months. We'll give it 2, because that means that you're future-proofing it, you're giving it more than enough resources just to be on the safe side, particularly if it grows faster than you expect. And then lastly, consider the application. Now this is most significant when you're downsizing a virtual machine. Certain applications have minimum requirements, and you do not want to drop below those. If you're running a Java application, which has a minimum, Java heap size, you don't want to be dropping the memory allocation below that Java heap size because that can cause problems. And there's other applications that have similar requirements that they either won't run or they'll have performance problems if you drop their allocations below a certain level. So just consider the application when you're doing this. Lastly, go ahead, change the VM allocation. You've done your research. You've understand the virtual machine's peaks, you understand the application itself. Go ahead and change that allocation, and then kind of like earlier, you can add that to a regular VM monitoring schedule or wait until someone screams in the future to see if you need to go ahead and increase that. So some of the key takeaways here. First of all, once again, capacity management is about balancing performance and cost. I've seen people who err on either side. I have seen people who I go in, they tell me they're ordering a new cluster, and I look at their existing cluster, and I'm like, guys, what are you doing? You're not growing very fast, and you've got tons of capacity. Why are you buying another cluster? It's throwing your IT budget out the window. At the same time, I've seen people who err on the other side, where they either wait too long to be able to understand what their capacity is, and their HA requirements aren't being met. They start encountering ballooning, CPU ready issues, and performance starts to suffer. You can get the best of both worlds if you're successfully managing your capacity, as shown in this presentation. Likewise, capacity is managed at both the hardware level and the VM level. A lot of times when people talk about capacity management, they're only thinking about the hosts and the clusters. But I'm going to tell you that capacity management has a macro level and a micro level. The macro level is the hosts and the clusters. The micro level is the virtual machines. And how you size virtual machines is going to impact the macro level. And lastly, there is a science and a strategy to successful capacity management. The principles I've laid out for you here will help you in doing that. Now, if any of you are looking at this and you're thinking to yourselves, my environment's too big. I've got too many virtual machines. I've got too many hosts. To do this manually is too time intensive. I would say don't go blind. Get some sort of tool, a free one. I'm not trying to pitch at all. vKernel is certainly something that can help out. There's other tools out there that can help do capacity management as well. I'll tell you that vKernel is the best, but certainly use something. Don't go blind on this. Guessing, as I mentioned in the title of this presentation, guessing is not a strategy. So thank you all for your time. It's been awesome. And in fact, I can see many of you taking notes. I think this has been a beneficial session to many. Certainly I'll stick around for questions. You can see that here's my contact info. Feel free to contact me at my email address, abuse that. There's my Twitter handle at the bottom. And then, of course, if you're interested in capacity management solutions at all, vKernel is listed as a website there, and you can go ahead and take a peek. Thank you again for your time.